Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Appalachian Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the fall of 1937, the isolated community of Ravens Hollow in western North Carolina was shaken by a series of disappearances that would later be connected to one of the most disturbing family legacies ever documented in the region. What began as a simple missing persons report evolved into a case that would haunt local law enforcement for decades and remain largely buried in county records until 1965, when a graduate student from Duke University uncovered a series of forgotten documents while researching Appalachian family structures. The Harrington family had lived in the same weathered farmhouse at the end of Blackwater Road for over 4 generations. The property sat nestled in a narrow valley, flanked by steep wooded slopes that cut off direct sunlight by mid-afternoon, casting the homestead in premature darkness. Neighbors were few and far between, with the closest being the Carmichael Farm, some 3 miles down the winding dirt road that frequently became impassable during the region's harsh winters. According to county tax records from 1932, the Harrington property comprised approximately 120 acres, much of it unsuitable for cultivation due to the steep terrain. The family maintained a small tobacco crop, kept a modest herd of cattle, and was known to hunt extensively in the surrounding woods. What made the Harringtons notable in the sparsely populated community was their extreme self-sufficiency and increasingly limited interaction with the outside world. The earliest documented concerns about the Harrington family can be traced to church attendance records from the Ravens Hollow Methodist congregation. These records, preserved in the county historical archives, show regular attendance by all adult Harringtons through 1919, followed by a sharp decline after Silas Harrington returned from service in the Great War. By 1925, no member of the family appeared on the attendance logs, despite religious participation being a central aspect of community life in the region at that time. Reverend Isaiah Thornton, who led the congregation from 1918 until his death in 1941, kept detailed notes on his pastoral visits. In a leather-bound journal discovered among his personal effects in 1960, Thornton described his final visit to the Harrington property in June of 1925. Called upon the Harrington household today to inquire after their absence from Sunday services. Silas received me on the porch but would not invite me inside. His manner was cordial enough, but his eyes held a strange intensity I have not observed in him before. He explained that the family had developed their own private devotions more suited to their needs. When I offered to provide guidance in this matter, his expression changed in a manner that caused me significant discomfort. I shall respect their wishes to worship in their own way, though I cannot shake the feeling that whatever practice they have adopted bears little resemblance to Christian devotion. Local merchant ledgers recovered from the general store in Ravens Hollow show that Silas Harrington made monthly trips into town for supplies, though these visits grew less frequent over the years 1934-1937. Store owner Jeremiah Wade noted in his personal journal that Silas spoke less with each visit, eyes never meeting mine, always scanning the store as if looking for something unseen. Wade's entries further describe how Silas's purchasing patterns changed over time, shifting from typical household goods to more specialized items, unusual quantities of salt, chemical compounds used in preservation, and special order books on subjects ranging from anatomy to ancient religious practices. The family consisted of Silas, his wife Constance, his brother Zachariah, and 2 cousins, Montgomery and Abigail Harrington. Census records from 1930 confirm this household composition, though interviews with elderly residents conducted in 1962 suggest there may have been other family members not officially documented. This discrepancy would later become significant to investigators. Constance Harrington, according to local accounts, had once been a sociable woman, known for her skill with medicinal herbs and midwifery. Multiple sources indicate she had assisted with births throughout the community until approximately 1926, when she abruptly ceased these activities. Sarah Blackburn, who was interviewed in 1962 at the age of 89, recalled that the last woman Constance attended, Martha Jenkins, had experienced an unusually difficult delivery. Martha wasn't the same afterward, Blackburn stated. The child lived only 3 days, born with peculiarities that folks didn't speak of openly. Martha claimed that during the birth, Constance had administered something that caused her terrible visions, and that she had overheard Constance and Silas discussing the child as if it were some kind of experiment. No one took her claims seriously, attributing them to the trauma of losing her baby, but Constance never served as midwife again. Montgomery Harrington remained the most elusive family member in public records prior to 1937. Tax documents indicate he had briefly owned a parcel of land near Asheville in the early 1920s before selling it and moving to the family homestead. A single photograph discovered in the archives of the Asheville Citizen-Times newspaper shows Montgomery at a county agricultural fair in 1922, standing rigidly beside a display of unusual cultivated fungi that had won a special recognition award. The accompanying article described him as a solitary man of scientific inclination, whose innovative cultivation techniques have produced specimens of remarkable size and unusual properties. The first recorded incident that would eventually connect to the larger Harrington case occurred on September 17, 1937, when local hunter Wesley Powell failed to return from a hunting trip in the woods adjacent to the Harrington property. Powell, an experienced outdoorsman who knew the area well, had mentioned to his wife his intention to try new hunting grounds closer to the ridge that overlooked the Harrington Valley. 3 days later, a search party organized by Sheriff Edgar Lawson found no trace of Powell beyond a single shotgun shell approximately half a mile from the Harrington property line. The shell, according to Sheriff Lawson's report, was found in an area where the underbrush had been disturbed, suggesting a possible struggle or hasty movement through the vegetation. Several broken branches were noted along what appeared to be a trail leading deeper into the forest, but the trail ended abruptly at a rock face where tracking dogs lost the scent. Sheriff Lawson's initial report, filed on September 22, 1937, notes that he interviewed Silas Harrington, who claimed to have heard a single gunshot around dusk on the 17th, but had not investigated, as hunting sounds are common in these parts. The interview, according to Lawson's notes, was conducted on the road leading to the property, as Silas seemed unwilling to invite me onto the homestead proper. What Lawson found most peculiar, as detailed in his personal notes rather than the official report, was Silas's apparent foreknowledge of Powell's disappearance. Before I mentioned Powell by name, Lawson wrote, Harrington asked if I was inquiring about the hunter who had gone missing. When questioned how he knew about a missing hunter, Silas claimed to have heard it from Montgomery, who had allegedly encountered another member of the search party the previous day. However, I had specifically instructed all searchers to avoid the Harrington property until I had conducted my interview. The inconsistency was noted but not immediately acted upon. Sheriff Lawson, with limited resources and no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, could only document his suspicions and continue the search for Powell, which would ultimately prove fruitless. October brought unusually heavy rains to Ravens Hollow. County weather records indicate nearly twice the normal precipitation, causing minor flooding and making the mountain roads treacherous. It was during this period that a second disappearance occurred. Marion Blackwood, a traveling salesman from Tennessee, was reported missing after failing to arrive at his next scheduled stop in Asheville. His last known location, according to his sales route ledger, was Ravens Hollow on October 9, 1937. Blackwood's automobile, a 1935 Ford sedan, was discovered abandoned on a turnout approximately 1 mile from the Harrington property. The vehicle contained Blackwood's sample case and personal effects. suggesting he had not intended to abandon the car. Sheriff Lawson's report indicates that the car appeared to have been pulled off the road in an orderly fashion, with no signs of struggle or forced departure. A detailed inventory of the vehicle's contents, conducted by Deputy Samuel Thornton, revealed several curious details. Blackwood's sales ledger showed that his territory included parts of Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, selling pharmaceutical supplies primarily to rural doctors and small-town pharmacies. The ledger's final entry, dated October 9th, noted, "Inquiry from isolated property RE, specialized preservation chemicals, promising lead." No client name was recorded, but the location description was consistent with the general vicinity of the Harrington homestead. The investigation into Blackwood's disappearance was hampered by the continued rainfall. Tracking dogs brought in from a neighboring county could find no scent trail beyond the vehicle, and the few footprints discovered nearby had been largely washed away. Once again, Silas Harrington was interviewed, this time accompanied by his brother Zachariah. Both men denied seeing any unfamiliar vehicles or persons in the vicinity of their property. According to Sheriff Lawson's notes, dated October 14, 1937, Zachariah Harrington appeared unusually agitated during the interview, repeatedly glancing toward the homestead and speaking only when directly addressed. When asked if a salesman had approached their property, Zachariah abruptly stated, "We have no need for things from the outside," before falling silent for the remainder of the interview. Sheriff Lawson noted a distinct physical change in Zachariah since his last encounter with the man some months earlier at the general store. "Z. Harrington's complexion has taken on a grayish pallor," he wrote, "and his movements demonstrate a curious stiffness, particularly in the neck and shoulders." When questioned about his health, S. Harrington interjected that his brother had been suffering from mountain rheumatics and was under treatment. What specifically drew Lawson's attention was that Zachariah's hands, despite the supposed joint ailment, showed calluses and staining consistent with extensive manual labor. When Lawson attempted to press further regarding the nature of any visitors to the property, Silas terminated the interview, stating they needed to return to attend to chores before darkness fell. As the men departed, Lawson observed that despite the heavy rainfall, neither wore adequate protection against the weather, yet seemed entirely unconcerned by the soaking they received on the walk back to their property. By November 1937, an atmosphere of unease had settled over Ravens Hollow. Church attendance records from the local Methodist congregation show several services dedicated to praying for the missing men. Local newspaper archives contain a brief article dated November 8, 1937, in which Sheriff Lawson urged residents to remain vigilant but not succumb to unfounded rumors regarding the recent disappearances. What these unfounded rumors entailed was not specified in the article, but interviews conducted decades later with surviving residents suggest that whispers about the Harrington family had begun to circulate. Meredith Jenkins, who was 16 years old in 1937, recalled in a 1964 interview that her father had forbidden the family from traveling near the Harrington property, saying only that those folks ain't right and never have been. Another resident, Harold Cooper, recounted a disturbing encounter his father had experienced in late October 1937. According to Cooper, his father had been returning from a neighboring town after nightfall when he observed what he described as a procession of lanterns moving through the woods near the Harrington property. Curiosity led him to stop his truck and watch from a distance. Cooper's father claimed to have seen at least 6 figures moving in a precise formation between the trees, though he could not make out their features in the darkness. What disturbed him most was that despite the uneven terrain and dense underbrush, the lanterns moved with a synchronized, almost mechanical precision that seemed unnatural for human movement. The turning point in the investigation came on November 23, 1937, when local farmer Everett Carmichael reported an unsettling encounter. According to Sheriff Lawson's report, Carmichael had been searching for several missing cattle when he observed unusual activity at the Harrington property from a ridge overlooking the valley. Carmichael described seeing all 5 known Harrington family members engaged in what appeared to be the construction of a structure behind the main house, working well after sunset by lantern light. What disturbed Carmichael, as noted in the sheriff's report, was not the construction itself, but the presence of what he described as at least 3 additional persons helping with the work, individuals he could not identify as known members of the community. When Carmichael returned the following day to continue his search for the missing cattle, he noticed that the partially constructed structure was now covered with canvas tarps, obscuring it from view. Carmichael's statement, preserved in the county archives, includes additional details not mentioned in the official report. He described observing the work through binoculars and noted that all individuals moved with the same peculiar stiffness he had observed in Zachariah Harrington during a chance encounter at the property boundary some weeks earlier. More disturbing was his observation that the unknown individuals appeared to be wearing ill-fitting clothing, as if unaccustomed to such garments, and that one figure's movements were so awkward that Carmichael initially mistook it for a person with a severe physical disability. Sheriff Lawson, who had been gathering these increasingly troubling reports while lacking sufficient evidence for official action, decided to conduct a direct inspection of the Harrington property. On November 25, 1937, accompanied by deputies Samuel Thornton and James Whitaker, he made the first official visit to the Harrington homestead. The report filed afterward describes a property in a state of controlled disarray. The main house, a 2-story structure built in the late 1800s, showed signs of extensive modification, with several windows boarded over, and what appeared to be a newly constructed addition extending from the rear. The deputies noted multiple outbuildings in various states of repair, including a large barn, 2 storage sheds, a smokehouse, and the partially completed structure that Carmichael had observed. This newest building was situated approximately 50 yards behind the main house, partially concealed by a stand of pine trees. It was constructed of rough-hewn timber with no windows and a single heavy door that was secured with multiple locks. When questioned about the construction observed by Carmichael, Silas Harrington explained they were merely building a new smokehouse for the winter. Sheriff Lawson requested to see this structure, but according to his report, Silas claimed it wasn't yet ready to be shown. When pressed on the identity of the additional workers observed, Silas became visibly tense, stating only that they were distant relations passing through. The report notes that during the conversation, which took place in the front yard of the property, all other family members remained inside the house, despite it being mid-afternoon on a clear day. Deputy Thornton noted that he observed movement behind curtains in several windows, suggesting they were being watched throughout the interview. The most unsettling observation, recorded by Deputy Whitaker in a supplementary note, was the condition of the property's livestock. The cattle, though adequate in number, appeared unnaturally docile and exhibited what Whitaker described as vacant stares. More concerning were several animals that had been isolated in separate pens. These creatures, which Whitaker initially assumed were diseased, displayed unusual physical characteristics including patchy hair loss, malformed limbs, and in one case what appeared to be an extra appendage protruding from the shoulder region. When questioned about these animals, Silas explained that they suffered from a mountain malady that afflicts cattle in these parts and were being kept separate to prevent contagion. Deputy Whitaker, who had grown up on a farm and was familiar with common livestock diseases, noted that he had never encountered nor heard tell of any natural ailment presenting such symptoms. Without sufficient cause for a search warrant, by the standards of the time, Sheriff Lawson could only make note of his observations and depart. His report concludes with a personal observation that something unwholesome permeates the Harrington property, though I cannot place the exact nature of my discomfort. Following this visit, Lawson began compiling a more comprehensive file on the Harrington family, gathering historical records and statements from longtime residents. This unofficial investigation, conducted largely on his own time, revealed several patterns that further heightened his concerns. County death records showed that between 1920 and 1930, 9 members of the extended Harrington family had died, an unusually high mortality rate, even for the period. The causes listed were vague: natural decline, wasting ailment, or simply unknown causes, and notably, none of the deaths had been examined by the county coroner, with death certificates signed by either Silas Harrington himself or, in 2 cases, by a physician from Asheville, who had since relocated to another state. Property records indicated that the Harrington family had gradually acquired additional land surrounding their original homestead, often purchasing parcels at below-market rates from owners eager to sell. One such transaction, completed in 1933, involved a 30-acre tract directly adjacent to the main property. The previous owner, Joseph Merritt, had reportedly experienced troubling dreams and unexplained livestock deaths before selling the land and relocating to Ohio. Most notably, Lawson discovered a series of unusual orders placed through the general store by Silas Harrington, beginning in 1930. These included chemical compounds typically used in medical or scientific applications, specialized tools that seemed ill-suited for typical farm work, and various books on subjects ranging from comparative anatomy to ancient mystical practices. One order, placed in early 1937, had been for an unusually large quantity of salt, formaldehyde, and specialized glass containers, items consistent with preserving biological specimens. The winter of 1937-1938 was particularly harsh in western North Carolina. Weather records indicate temperatures well below average and snowfall that effectively isolated many mountain communities for weeks at a time. During this period, no further disappearances were reported, and the Harrington family made no appearances in town, which was not unusual given the weather conditions and their self-sufficient lifestyle. Sheriff Lawson used this period to correspond with law enforcement officials in neighboring counties and states, inquiring about similar disappearances or unusual family groups matching the Harrington profile. Most responses were negative, though a sheriff from eastern Tennessee mentioned a case from 1932 involving a traveling agricultural inspector who had vanished while visiting remote farms. The man's government vehicle had been found abandoned near a property owned by individuals named Harrison, who were described as reclusive and unwelcoming to outsiders. By the time authorities investigated further, the Harrison family had relocated, leaving behind a homestead with unusual modifications to the cellar area, including what appeared to be restraint devices affixed to the walls. When spring arrived, however, residents of Ravens Hollow noticed a change in the Harrington family's behavior. According to general store records, Silas began making more frequent trips to town, purchasing larger quantities of supplies than usual. The store owner's journal entry from April 12, 1938, notes that Silas appeared gaunt and weathered beyond his years, and that his hand showed signs of labor beyond the usual farming work, with unusual calluses and staining. More notably, Silas was now accompanied by his cousin Montgomery on these trips, a man rarely seen in town before. Montgomery was described in various accounts as tall and thin, with a distinctive rigid posture and a tendency to stand uncomfortably close when speaking to others. The postmaster, Harold Griffin, noted in a letter to his sister, recovered in 1964, that Montgomery Harrington had inquired about mail service to locations as far away as Oklahoma and Missouri, explaining they had family interests in those regions. Several witnesses reported that Montgomery exhibited odd behavioral traits during these visits. Martha Wilson, who worked at the general store, described in a later interview how Montgomery would sometimes pause mid-sentence and remain completely motionless for several seconds before continuing as if nothing had happened. She also noted his unusual speech pattern, which she described as too precise, like each word was being selected individually rather than flowing naturally. The most disturbing account came from Dr. William Foster, the town's physician, who encountered Montgomery at the post office in late April 1938. According to Foster's medical journal, he observed what appeared to be a surgical incision along Montgomery's jawline, partially concealed by his collar, but visible when he turned his head. When Foster professionally inquired about the wound, offering medical assistance, Montgomery's response was troubling. "It is not a wound, doctor. It is an improvement." Before Foster could inquire further, Silas intervened, explaining that Montgomery had suffered an injury that had required treatment in Asheville, and quickly ushered his cousin from the building. The investigation took an unexpected turn on May 3, 1938, when Virginia Powell, wife of the still-missing Wesley Powell, reported a disturbing discovery. While cleaning out her husband's hunting cabin in preparation for selling the property, she found a journal she had not previously known existed. The journal, which contained entries dating back several years, revealed that Wesley had developed an interest in the Harrington family long before his disappearance. According to Sheriff Lawson's report, the journal detailed Powell's observations of the Harrington property made from various vantage points in the surrounding forest. Powell had documented strange sounds emanating from the property during these gatherings, what he described as rhythmic chanting in no language I recognize, and mechanical whirring punctuated by sounds that resemble neither man nor beast. More concerning were his observations of unusual smoke rising from the chimney of the main house at odd hours, which he described as bearing a distinctive green tint and an odor so foul it caused discomfort, even at a considerable distance. Most significantly, an entry dated just 3 days before Powell's disappearance mentioned his intention to approach closer than before, to observe what he described as a structure taking shape in the eastern clearing, unlike any farm building I've encountered. The journal's final entry, dated September 16, 1937, simply stated, "Tomorrow I will know for certain." Virginia Powell also provided Sheriff Lawson with a map found within the journal on which her husband had marked several observation points around the Harrington property and what he believed to be underground features, indicated by dotted lines extending from the main house to various outbuildings. The entries described unusual patterns of behavior, including what Powell termed night gatherings, where multiple lanterns could be seen moving between the main house and the surrounding outbuildings in what appeared to be organized patterns. How Powell had determined the existence of these supposed tunnels was not explained in the journal, though one entry made reference to unusual depressions in the soil following the spring thaw, suggesting excavation beneath. Armed with this new information, Sheriff Lawson obtained a warrant to search the Harrington property. On May 7, 1938, he and 4 deputies approached the homestead, only to discover that the Harrington family appeared to have departed. The property showed signs of hasty abandonment, with doors left ajar and personal items scattered about. The main house, when entered, presented an unsettling scene. The front rooms appeared relatively normal, if austere, with simple furniture and few personal touches. As the deputies moved deeper into the structure, however, they encountered increasingly disturbing modifications. The rear addition, which was accessible only through a heavy door equipped with multiple locks, contained what appeared to be a makeshift laboratory. Deputy Thornton's inventory, included in the official report, described glass vessels of various sizes, surgical implements, and specialized equipment whose purpose was not immediately evident. Most disturbing were numerous jars containing preserved specimens that appeared to be organs and tissue samples of unknown origin. Some bore labels in a cipher that could not be immediately decoded, while others contained what Deputy Thornton described as biological material exhibiting mutations or deliberate modifications inconsistent with natural development. The search that followed revealed the first concrete evidence that something truly disturbing had occurred on the Harrington property. In a root cellar beneath the main house, investigators discovered a hidden doorway leading to a system of tunnels extending deep into the hillside behind the property. These tunnels, carefully shored up with timber supports, connected several underground chambers of varying sizes. In one chamber, described in the official report as approximately 15 feet square, investigators discovered what appeared to be a workshop containing unusual tools, glass vessels of unknown purpose, and extensive journals written in what Deputy Thornton described as a cipher or code unlike anything I've encountered. Attempts to decode these journals at the time were unsuccessful. Another chamber contained personal effects that would later be identified as belonging to both Wesley Powell and Marion Blackwood, the missing salesman. Powell's hunting knife and a monogrammed handkerchief belonging to Blackwood were among the items recovered. However, no human remains were found during the initial search. Deputy Whitaker's section of the report describes a chamber that contained 7 metal tables arranged in a row, each equipped with restraints and drainage systems that led to collection vessels. The surfaces showed evidence of extensive cleaning, but residual staining suggested long-term use for purposes involving bodily fluids. Adjacent to this room was a smaller chamber containing shelves of glass jars, many of which had been emptied but some still containing preserved specimens labeled with the same indecipherable cipher. The most disturbing discovery, as noted in Sheriff Lawson's report, was a large chamber at the farthest extent of the tunnel system. This room, approximately 20 feet in diameter with a domed ceiling, contained 7 stone slabs arranged in a circular pattern. Each slab bore unusual markings carved into the surface and showed evidence of extensive staining. Subsequent analysis by a chemist from Asheville confirmed that at least some of the staining was consistent with human blood. At the center of this circular arrangement stood a pedestal of rough-hewn stone, supporting a metal device that defied immediate identification. The apparatus, approximately 3 feet tall, consisted of interlocking brass components, glass tubes, and what appeared to be electrical elements, though no power source was evident. When Sheriff Lawson attempted to examine the device more closely, he reported experiencing an acute sensation of dizziness and disorientation that subsided only after he retreated from the chamber. The full excavation of the tunnel system took nearly a week and revealed additional chambers that appeared to serve various functions, from storage of chemical compounds to what seemed to be living quarters equipped with rudimentary bedding. One particularly troubling discovery was a small room containing items of clothing sized for individuals not accounted for among the known Harrington family members, including several garments that matched descriptions of those worn by Wesley Powell and Marion Blackwood on the days of their respective disappearances. The investigation that followed was extensive by the standards of the time, but limited by the resources available to a rural sheriff's department in the late 1930s. A bulletin was issued for the apprehension of the Harrington family, but no confirmed sightings were ever reported. The case files indicate that inquiries were sent to law enforcement in neighboring states, including Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia, but no responses yielded actionable information. Several items recovered from the property were sent to specialists at the state level for analysis. A preliminary report from the state chemist's office, dated June 12, 1938, identified numerous compounds found in the laboratory space, including several that were described as consistent with experimental medical research, though combined in unorthodox formulations. The report specifically noted the presence of preservative chemicals, various anesthetics, and compounds typically used in the treatment of tissue samples for microscopic examination. More puzzling were several mixtures that the state chemist could not readily identify. The report states, Sample 17B contains elements that appear to be derived from organic sources, possibly fungal, but modified through unknown processes. The resulting compound bears structural similarities to certain neurotoxins, though its precise effects cannot be determined without further testing. I must note that when handling this substance, even with appropriate precautions, Laboratory staff reported unusual sensory experiences, including vivid auditory hallucinations and a persistent sensation of being observed. The property was placed under government control, and access was restricted to authorized personnel. However, budget constraints meant that regular patrols of the isolated location were impractical. According to maintenance records, the property was inspected quarterly by county officials until 1942, when wartime resource limitations resulted in less frequent oversight. Sheriff Lawson continued to investigate the Harrington case until his retirement in 1946, though with diminishing official support as the years passed. His personal files, which were donated to the County Historical Society after his death in 1952, reveal that he maintained correspondence with law enforcement officials across multiple states, tracking reports of missing persons and unusual family groups that might be connected to the Harringtons. In a letter to his successor dated December 1946, Lawson wrote, "I cannot in good conscience leave this office without expressing my firm belief that the Harrington matter represents an ongoing threat. What we discovered in those tunnels suggests activities so far beyond the bounds of human decency that they can scarcely be contemplated. Yet the family themselves eluded justice. I am convinced they merely relocated to continue their work elsewhere, and that similar disappearances will follow wherever they establish themselves. I urge you to maintain vigilance regarding reports that may connect to this case, particularly those involving missing persons in isolated rural areas and sightings of individuals exhibiting the peculiar physical characteristics associated with the Harrington family." The case might have remained simply another unsolved mystery in the annals of Appalachian history had it not been for the work of Dr. Malcolm Reynolds, a cultural anthropologist from Duke University. In 1963, while researching isolated family structures in the Appalachian region, Reynolds stumbled upon references to the Harrington case in county archives. Intrigued by the unusual details, Reynolds obtained permission to conduct interviews with surviving residents of Ravens Hollow who had lived there during the period in question. These interviews, conducted throughout 1964, revealed additional context that had never been officially documented. According to Reynolds' research notes, the Harrington family had a reputation for unusual behavior dating back to the early 1900s. Older residents recalled that the family had always been reclusive, but that their isolation had increased markedly after Silas returned from serving in the Great War in 1919. Several interviewees mentioned rumors that Silas had brought something back with him from Europe, though none could articulate exactly what this meant. One elderly resident, Jacob Merritt, whose family had owned property adjacent to the Harringtons before selling it in 1933, provided Reynolds with a disturbing account passed down from his father. According to this family story, Silas had returned from the war, changed in ways that went beyond the usual hardships of combat. Merritt's father had encountered Silas shortly after his return and observed unusual scarring on his forearms that Silas claimed were from a gas attack. However, the pattern of the scarring appeared more consistent with deliberate incisions than chemical burns, and Silas was observed on multiple occasions studying these marks with apparent satisfaction rather than distress. Perhaps most significantly, Reynolds discovered through church records that the Harrington family had once been considerably larger. Baptismal records from 1880 to 1910 indicated at least 14 individuals with the Harrington surname, yet by the 1930 census, only 5 remained. When Reynolds inquired about this discrepancy, he encountered what he described in his notes as a collective reluctance to discuss the matter. One elderly resident, speaking on condition of anonymity, finally revealed that there had been a series of unexplained ailments that affected the Harrington family in the 1920s. These illnesses reportedly caused unusual physical and behavioral changes before ultimately resulting in death. Local physician Dr. Samuel Grant had been called to the property several times during this period, but had been increasingly turned away as the family began treating their own. Dr. Grant's medical journal, which Reynolds managed to locate in the possession of the physician's daughter, contained troubling observations. In an entry dated July 1924, Grant described treating a young Harrington woman, first name illegible, possibly Clara or Cora, who exhibited an alarming rigidity of the limbs and unusual pallor, accompanied by periods of lucidity interspersed with incomprehensible ramblings about the change coming from within. A subsequent entry, dated September 1924, noted, "Visited the Harrington property today to check on Clara's condition, only to be informed by Silas that she had passed during the night. When I requested to examine the body, as is customary to determine cause of death, I was told that they had already prepared her for burial according to family traditions that precluded outside intervention. I found this highly irregular and expressed as much, at which point Zachariah emerged from the house in a state of considerable agitation. His appearance shocked me, as he displayed several of the same symptoms I had observed in Clara: the unnatural pallor, stiffened gait, and a peculiar flatness of affect. When I offered to examine him, Silas intervened most forcefully, stating that the family takes care of its own and requesting that I leave the property." In his final entry regarding the Harrington family, dated September 1926, Dr. Grant wrote, "I fear what is happening in that household is beyond medical science as we understand it. There is something deeply unnatural in the progression of symptoms, and in my darkest thoughts I question whether these deaths are entirely unwelcome to Silas and his inner circle. I have consulted medical texts regarding similar presentations but can find no recognized disease that accounts for the specific constellation of symptoms. Most troubling is my growing suspicion that whatever afflicts the Harringtons may be deliberately cultivated rather than merely suffered." Reynolds's investigation took its most significant turn in early 1965, when he received permission to re-examine the Harrington property, which had remained under loose government oversight, but had not been thoroughly inspected in years. The main house had collapsed due to neglect, but the tunnel system, protected from the elements, remained largely intact. Using more advanced equipment than had been available to Sheriff Lawson in 1938, Reynolds and a team from Duke University conducted a methodical exploration of the underground chambers. Ground-penetrating radar revealed additional tunnels that had not been discovered during the original investigation, including one that had apparently been deliberately collapsed. When excavated, this tunnel led to a chamber containing what Reynolds described in his report as evidence of extensive experimentation of an unknown nature. The room contained laboratory equipment that appeared to be a hybrid of standard medical tools and custom-fabricated devices of unclear purpose. Glass containers held preserved specimens that were initially thought to be animal in origin, though later analysis would raise disturbing questions about this assumption. The most significant discovery was a series of photographic plates stored in a sealed metal container. These images, though degraded by time and environmental conditions, depicted what appeared to be systematic surgical modifications performed on human subjects. Reynolds's report describes progressive alterations to anatomical structures and evidence of experimental grafting procedures that went far beyond any legitimate medical practice of the period. Due to the disturbing nature of these images, they were immediately classified and secured by federal authorities, who had been alerted to the discoveries. Most significantly, the team discovered a hidden compartment in the wall containing a leather-bound journal that had escaped the original investigators. Unlike the coded journals found earlier, this one was written in plain English, apparently by Zachariah Harrington. The journal, which covered the period from 1935 to late 1937, provided the first coherent glimpse into the disturbing activities of the Harrington family. According to Reynolds' analysis, the journal detailed Zachariah's increasing concern about experiments being conducted by Silas and Montgomery. The entries describe a process referred to only as the transformation, which apparently began after Silas returned from Europe with what Zachariah called the ancient knowledge. The journal suggested that the Harringtons believed they had discovered a method to transcend the limitations of human form through a combination of chemical compounds and ritualistic procedures. Early entries describe experiments conducted on animals, but later passages contain troubling references to willing family participants who had embraced the necessity of sacrifice for advancement. Zachariah's writings become increasingly agitated as the journal progresses, expressing both fascination and horror at the results of these experiments. In an entry dated August 1937, he wrote, "What emerged from the chamber today can no longer be called Cousin Abigail in any true sense, though it moves with purpose and retains fragments of her memories." Silas claims this is merely the transitional phase and that the final form will be glorious, but I cannot shake the sense that we have crossed a boundary not meant to be traversed. The journal contains detailed observations of the physical and mental changes exhibited by family members who underwent the transformation process. Zachariah described progressive alterations in skin texture, joint flexibility, and cognitive function. Most disturbing were his notes on changes in behavior, including what he termed the fading of human sentiment and the emergence of a collective consciousness that supersedes individual identity. A particularly troubling entry dated September 1937 stated the process has been refined considerably since the early attempts, which resulted in deterioration and death. The key, as Silas discovered, lies not in forcing the transformation, but in preparing the body to accept it willingly. The fungal compound, when properly cultivated and combined with the chemical agents recovered from the European texts, creates a gradual alteration rather than a catastrophic one. Montgomery's work in adapting the formula for varying physiologies has been essential, though I question the ethics of his methods. The final entries suggest that Zachariah had become increasingly concerned about Silas's plans to extend the family's work by bringing in outsiders. The last dated entry from November 10, 1937, states cryptically, "The hunter provided unexpected insights into the process of transformation in those not of our bloodline. The traveling man, less so." Silas now speaks of finding more suitable subjects, those whose disappearance might not draw attention so readily. I fear I have contributed to something that cannot be undone. Reynolds' report to the University Ethics Committee, dated March 1965, recommended that federal authorities be notified of his findings. However, university administrators, concerned about potential negative publicity, insisted on further verification before involving outside agencies. This bureaucratic delay would have significant consequences. When federal investigators finally arrived at the Harrington property in June 1965, they discovered that the site had been compromised. The entrance to the tunnel system had been unsealed, and evidence suggested that someone had systematically removed materials from the underground chambers. Most critically, Zachariah's journal was missing, with only Reynolds' notes and transcribed excerpts remaining as evidence of its contents. The investigation that followed was classified by federal authorities, and many details have never been made public. However, interviews with retired investigators conducted in the early 1990s for a historical society project reveal that at least 17 disappearances across 5 states between 1938 and 1965 contained elements that potentially connected them to the Harrington case. These connections included victims last seen near remote rural properties, purchased by individuals matching descriptions of Silas or Montgomery Harrington, though always under different names. In several cases, abandoned properties were found to contain evidence of hastily dismantled laboratory equipment and structural modifications similar to those at the original Harrington homestead. In a case from eastern Kentucky in 1944, local authorities investigating a series of livestock mutilations discovered an isolated farmhouse that had been abandoned shortly before their arrival. The property had been purchased 2 years earlier by a man calling himself Samuel Harrison, described by neighbors as tall and stiff in his movements with an unusually precise manner of speaking, details consistent with descriptions of Montgomery Harrington. The farmhouse cellar contained what the sheriff's report described as a makeshift laboratory with evidence of chemical experimentation and surgical procedures, along with diagrams of human and animal anatomy annotated in a cipher or code. A more direct connection emerged in a case from southern Missouri in 1952. A local hunter reported discovering an isolated cabin deep in the Ozarks where he observed unusual activities, including what appeared to be medical procedures being performed on restrained individuals. When authorities investigated 3 days later, they found the cabin empty but containing evidence that aligned with the Harrington case, including journals written in the same cipher found at the original homestead and specialized equipment that matched descriptions of items removed from the North Carolina property. Perhaps most disturbing were the accounts from law enforcement officers who investigated these properties. Multiple reports described experienced officers feeling an overwhelming sense of dread upon entering certain rooms, particularly root cellars and basement areas. One detective from Missouri, quoted anonymously in the Historical Society records, stated, "In 20 years of police work, I've never encountered a space that felt so intrinsically wrong as that cellar." It wasn't just the evidence of whatever had happened there. It was as if the very air had been tainted by it. The case saw renewed interest in 1968 when construction workers clearing land for a new highway approximately 30 miles from the original Harrington property discovered human remains in a remote cave system. Forensic analysis, limited by the technology of the time, suggested the remains belonged to at least 3 individuals and showed unusual signs of post-mortem modification that the medical examiner's report described as consistent with extensive surgical alteration. The report detailed anomalies including evidence of precise incisions along major muscle groups, unusual reinforcement of the skeletal structure with unidentified metallic elements, and modifications to the cranium that suggested deliberate reshaping of a nature inconsistent with any known medical or cultural practice. Most puzzling was the condition of the soft tissue, which showed minimal decomposition despite the medical examiner's estimate that the remains had been in the cave for at least a decade. Personal effects found with the remains included a pocket watch later identified as belonging to Marion Blackwood, the missing salesman from 1937. The most puzzling aspect of the discovery, as noted in the forensic report, was that the modifications to the remains appeared to have been performed while the subjects were still alive, with evidence of healing around certain alterations. The report concluded that the nature and extent of these modifications defy conventional medical explanation. By this time, the original investigation had been open for over 30 years, and many of those initially involved had retired or passed away. Sheriff Lawson had died in 1952, having never resolved what he described in his personal papers as the case that haunted my dreams. His successor showed little interest in revisiting what was viewed as a historical curiosity rather than an active investigation. Dr. Reynolds continued his research until his sudden death in 1969, officially attributed to a heart attack. His colleague, Dr. Evelyn Whitman, who had assisted in analyzing the materials from the Harrington property, noted in correspondence to Reynolds's family that he had become increasingly paranoid in the months before his death, convinced he was being watched and that someone had accessed his research materials when he was not present. In a particularly troubling letter dated just 2 weeks before his death, Reynolds wrote to Whitman, "I am increasingly convinced that what the Harrington family initiated did not end with their disappearance, but has continued to propagate in ways we have not yet grasped." The modifications they performed were not merely physical, but affected something more fundamental to human nature. Most disturbing is my growing suspicion that individuals connected to this case may be monitoring my research, perhaps even from within the university itself. There is a faculty member in the biology department whose mannerisms and physical characteristics bear an unsettling resemblance to descriptions of Montgomery Harrington, though he claims to have been born in Oregon and has documentation to support this assertion. Following Reynolds's death, his extensive notes on the Harrington case were donated to Duke University's archives. However, when Dr. Whitman attempted to access these materials for a planned publication in 1970, she discovered that significant portions were missing, including all transcripts of Zachariah's journal and the detailed analysis of the laboratory equipment found in the hidden chambers. The university claimed that Reynolds had never submitted these particular materials to the archive, despite Dr. Whitman's insistence that she had personally helped package them for storage. Her requests for an investigation were denied, and the university eventually issued a statement suggesting that Reynolds's work on the Harrington case had been largely speculative and lacking in scholarly rigor, effectively discrediting his findings. Dr. Whitman resigned from her position shortly afterward and largely withdrew from academic life. In a rare interview given to a local newspaper in 1978, she stated cryptically that some truths are deliberately buried, not because they cannot be proved, but because their implications are too disturbing to acknowledge. The interview was scheduled to continue in a subsequent issue, but the follow-up was never published, and attempts by researchers to locate Whitman in later years proved unsuccessful. The Harrington property itself remained under government ownership until 1972, when budget cuts led to its sale at auction. The buyer, a development company based in Charlotte, had plans to clear the land for a vacation home development. However, the project was abandoned after a series of accidents during the initial clearing work, including equipment failures and an unexplained fire that destroyed a temporary office structure. According to statements from workers involved in the project, collected by a local historian in the 1980s, the site was plagued by unusual difficulties from the beginning. Heavy equipment frequently malfunctioned when attempting to excavate certain areas, particularly in the vicinity of the collapsed tunnel system. Several workers reported experiencing unusual physical sensations, including dizziness, disorientation, and, in some cases, vivid hallucinations when working in specific locations on the property. The project foreman, Raymond Davies, described in his statement a particularly disturbing incident involving a bulldozer operator attempting to clear the area where the main house had stood. Morris had been working that section for maybe an hour when he suddenly stopped the machine and just sat there, staring straight ahead. When I approached to see what the problem was, I noticed he was sweating profusely despite the cool temperature. He didn't respond to my calls, and when I climbed up to check on him, his eyes were open but completely unfocused. I had to physically shake him to get any response, at which point he began speaking rapidly about seeing through different eyes and feeling the change starting. We got him to a hospital in Asheville, where he was diagnosed with heat exhaustion, though the day was overcast and mild. Morris had no recollection of the incident afterward and refused to return to the site. The land changed hands several more times over the following decades, but no development was ever successfully completed. Local real estate agents reportedly became reluctant to list the property, citing its unsavory history and practical difficulties with the terrain. By the mid-1980s, the area had been largely reclaimed by forest, with only the stone foundation of the original house and scattered remnants of outbuildings remaining visible. In 1992, a team of spelunkers exploring cave systems in the region stumbled upon what appeared to be a man-made tunnel that had been collapsed. Curiosity led them to partially clear the entrance, revealing a narrow passage that connected to what they described as a chamber with unusual stone fixtures. Before they could explore further, a partial collapse of the tunnel entrance forced them to retreat. When they returned the following day with reinforcement materials, they discovered that a more extensive collapse had completely sealed the tunnel. One member of the group, Joseph Merrick, later reported to park rangers that he had heard sounds like movement from within the sealed tunnel, as they were leaving the area, though his companions denied hearing anything unusual. Merrick became obsessed with the site, making repeated trips back to try to relocate the tunnel entrance. According to his girlfriend, Sarah Coleman, Merrick began having vivid nightmares and developed an unusual interest in obscure medical procedures and anatomical modification. Coleman reported that Merrick's personality underwent subtle changes, including increased precision in his speech patterns and an unusual stillness in his movements that she found increasingly unsettling. In December 1992, Merrick disappeared while on a solo hiking trip in the area. Despite an extensive search, no trace of him was ever found beyond his empty tent, and a journal containing increasingly disjointed entries about voices from beneath the mountain. The journal's final entry, dated December 12, 1992, stated, "I understand now. The Harringtons weren't creating monsters. They were becoming something else entirely. Something that could wait patiently in the dark for decades. I hear them moving below. Tonight, I'll meet them." The search for Merrick continued for several weeks, but yielded no results. Ranger reports note that search dogs exhibited unusual behavior in certain areas, becoming agitated and refusing to proceed, despite commands from their handlers. Ground-penetrating radar was employed to search for potential cave systems where Merrick might have fallen, but results were inconclusive due to what the technical report described as unusual interference patterns of unknown origin. The Harrington case has since faded into local legend, occasionally resurfacing in collections of Appalachian mysteries or academic papers on isolated mountain communities. Official records remain fragmentary, with key documents missing and others heavily redacted when accessed through Freedom of Information Act requests. What can be said with certainty is that between 1937 and 1938, something deeply disturbing occurred on the Harrington property. At least 2 men disappeared in connection with the family, and physical evidence suggested activities far beyond the acceptable bounds of human behavior. The family's subsequent disappearance and the possible connections to later cases across multiple states suggest a legacy of darkness that may not yet be fully resolved. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is not what is known, but what remains undiscovered. The full extent of the tunnel system has never been mapped, and the precise nature of the transformation described in Zachariah's journal remains unclear. The modified human remains found in 1968, present questions that, even with modern forensic techniques, might defy conventional explanation. In 2002, a historian researching Appalachian folk practices came across a reference in a collection of local legends to a family that changed themselves to escape death sometime in the early 20th century. The account described how these individuals still walk among us, wearing faces that almost resemble our own, learning our ways while waiting for the time when they no longer need to hide. The historian dismissed this as typical folklore, a story evolved from exaggerated accounts of the actual Harrington case. Yet one detail gives pause. The local tale specified that these beings could be identified by a subtle rigidity in their movements and a tendency to speak in unusually precise, measured tones, echoing descriptions of Montgomery Harrington from accounts dating back to 1938. As recently as 2011, a retired federal agent who had been involved in the 1965 investigation made a curious statement in a retirement interview. When asked about cases that remained unresolved, he mentioned the Harrington matter only briefly, saying, "Some investigations are closed not because they're solved, but because the truth is deemed too dangerous for public consumption. I'll say only this. I believe descendants of that family still exist, though descendants may not be the right word for what they've become." The agent refused to elaborate further and died unexpectedly 3 weeks later from what was ruled to be natural causes. His personal files, which colleagues believed contained unofficial notes on the Harrington case, were reportedly removed from his home by unidentified government representatives within hours of his death. Today, the land where the Harrington homestead once stood is part of a national forest preserve, unmarked on official maps and reportedly avoided by local guides and hunters. Those few who claim to have ventured into the area describe an unnatural silence, an absence of wildlife, and a persistent feeling of being observed from just beyond the limit of vision. Laboratory analysis revealed unusual fungal spores in samples from this specific location, exhibiting what the research paper described as novel structural characteristics and potential bioactive properties. When cultured in the laboratory, these fungi displayed growth patterns that the researcher characterized as seemingly responsive to external stimuli in a manner more typically associated with simple nervous systems than fungal organisms. Before further investigation could be conducted, the university laboratory experienced a break-in during which the cultures and all research notes were stolen. In 2013, a graduate student conducting research on soil composition in the region took samples from various locations within the national forest, including the approximate area of the former Harrington property. The only item recovered was a single sheet of paper left in the researcher's desk drawer containing the message, "Some doors should remain closed." The transformation continues. The message was written in handwriting that the student claimed did not belong to anyone with access to the laboratory. The true legacy of the Harrington family may never be fully understood. What began as a missing persons case in a remote mountain community has evolved into something that challenges our understanding of human nature itself. The fragments of evidence that remain point to possibilities too disturbing to fully contemplate, that in those isolated mountains, individuals found a way to transform themselves into something no longer entirely human, and that this transformation may continue, hidden in the shadows of rural America. Perhaps it is better that some mysteries remain unsolved, some doors remain closed. Yet, for those few who have glimpsed the truth behind the Harrington case, there is the unsettling knowledge that some doors, once opened, cannot be truly closed again. And in the deep hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, something waits, patient and watchful, neither fully alive nor truly dead, but irrevocably changed. As you reflect on this account of the Harrington family, consider the remote areas near your own community, the isolated properties where unusual activities might go unnoticed for years. Consider the strangers you encounter, whose movements seem just slightly wrong, whose expressions never quite reach their eyes. And perhaps, just perhaps, listen more carefully to the old local legends about families who found ways to cheat death through means both ancient and unnatural. For in the most remote corners of our world, in the deepest shadows of human experience, there exist possibilities that our rational minds prefer to deny, possibilities that the Harrington family may have embraced to their eternal cost and to ours.